So starting on the left, we have Jeff Butler, the creative director of EverQuest Next, Darren McPherson, our lead designer, Steve Denuzer, a senior designer, and Ryan Barker, also a senior designer, our lore lead. All right, so Jeff, you ready? Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
Nagathon hat.
Oh, Nagathon.
We'll figure out the Nagathon hat.
Okay.
Yeah, we got
Awesome. Hey, you know, if we don't have a plan for giving away the Nagathon hat, I'll come up with a question that you guys can ask me later. You probably won't know the answer to it.
It'll be a question that only Jeff knows the answer to. So,
or I'll just change the answer.
Yeah, we have a plan for the hat. I just was unaware of it. I apologize.
If you could work on getting me a hat, Terry, that'd be pretty cool.
But you spend so
Are we
much
doing the hat
time
later
on your
then?
hair, Jeff.
the hat later.
Okay, hat later.
Awesome.
Got it later.
Stay tuned for hats.
Let's not talk about the hat.
For some reason, I always get stuck talking about philosophy. So today I want to talk to you about the philosophy behind the lore design for EverQuest Next. As Dave said in his presentation, the lore for EverQuest Next is a total reboot of the franchise and the flagship IP for Sony Online Entertainment. And the recent Star Trek movie is an excellent example of the approach that we're taking. Hold on one second.
Keep going. There you go.
Here we go.
Who? That's me, I guess. That's not very nice.
Yep, that looks like Darren McPherson to me.
Is the thinker?
Although,
He sits like that at work. all the
seriously,
time.
not to deflect this, but does the thinker have clothes on in the famous statue? I don't think he does.
So the original of this didn't. Thank goodness Rosie, our art director, commanded them to put clothes on it. But
Those who saw the original cannot unsee it.
right, it wasn't pretty.
I think the players would have appreciated the original, truthfully. Truthfully. So, expect a retelling and reimagining of the EverQuest story, drawing on nostalgia for the franchise and in homage to all the EverQuests who precede us to this point. Many of the original creators of EverQuest are on the EverQuest Next team. Those of you who are familiar with the old lore and the original game should remember the name of Bill Trost, who was the EverQuest lead designer. He recently rejoined us from Tryon, and he is now on the EverQuest Next team. So we have access to his understanding of the foundational lore of this game, the reasons why he wrote every single character that existed in the original game at its launch, every individual piece of lore, the underlying story of Kinos, the Combine, everything about the world was his responsibility and his purview, and we have that to draw on now. We also have, and on this panel, Ryan Barker, who's a veteran of 13 EverQuest expansions. Together, the body of knowledge that we have related to EverQuest and EverQuest lore couldn't be duplicated, not even within our own company. You'll see the quality and the attention to detail and the understanding of the lore that comes from the participation of all those people. As we mentioned in the World panel, you'll see familiar faces and names. You'll visit places that are familiar to you from previous games in EverQuest Next, and you'll see a lot of new stuff besides. And we wanted to talk a little bit about Karamor Thex.
So yeah, Karamor Thex is, those of you who are familiar with the EQ1 and EQ2 lore will recognize the Thex name for sure as one of Elven royalty, and we're bringing that family back. They'll be a lot different this time though, and Karamor is an example of a new character set and really grounded in the old lore.
So, before you go on, I wanted to explain one of the reasons why we chose to do the reset. It's not just to support Transmedia, which you'll see more of from us in upcoming weeks, with things like the short stories from Maxwell Alexander Drake and Robert Lassen. one of which is already posted up on our website. That's the story about the Tear Doll. It's our intent to open doors and effectively build upon the concepts that we talked about in showing off your creativity this morning, where we were working on critical mass. We want our players to have multiple points of entry to our intellectual property. We want them to have multiple points of entry to our game. I'll be very happy if in the future I encounter somebody on a plane or at GDC or any place out in the world that is familiar with EverQuest lore because they've been reading books. They may not even own a PC. They may never played a massively multiplayer game. It's my desire for people to participate in our world through as many opportunities and from as many avenues as humanly possible. So it's our responsibility to set a bar for the quality of the lore and the story that permits us to do that. Whether or not, as every people in this room, you care about the game that we're all playing together, we still want to be all-inclusive. So that's what you should expect from us as relates to the philosophy and the quality of the lore that we're trying to deliver to you.
And just to touch on that a little bit more, we really want the lore to stand up on its own, independent of the game, so that we can really branch out beyond the game. Once we have the world, we might make several games in this world at some point, have lots of stories that are coming from that, novels, things like that. So.
Yeah, we built this really deep timeline with a lot of hooks in it. So EverQuest Next is set at a very particular point in that timeline, but there's a wealth of stories, a wealth of characters, a wealth of depth to the world that could serve as the settings for other stories, other books, other games, and part of this rebuilding of the franchise process is to give us those opportunities for the future.
So, as Steve mentioned yesterday in the World panel, deep is both a figurative and a literal term. We have to have all of these stories. We have to have all this history so that we can give you an authentic and genuine bit of archaeology when you dig under keynotes. You need to know what all of those things were. We have some really good methods of storytelling that we want to share with you now. We really have this motto of show and don't tell. Does anyone read quest text, or you just skip through that stuff? I know there's a few quest text readers out there, but I think that there's
this panel's a little
large,
slanted.
Yeah. So actually, okay. So this is not the right crowd to ask this question, because this is the lore crowd. But there are a large amount of people who just click through the game, and we really want the story, them to be delivered the same story that you lore readers are getting. So one of our things is that we really want to show through what's happening in the environment, what's going on. Visual storytelling. We have some amazing AI. We keep mentioning this, mention it in every panel. When you walk into a city, and I'm going to steal Steve's example here, because I'm a jerk like that. You walk into a city, and this city's being harassed by invading orcs. The people are in their homes. They look terrified. There's not children playing in the streets. No one is tending to the fields, and the city will decay, and eventually people will move out. And we can imagine that if nobody does anything about this, that eventually there will just be a ruin there. The world evolves this way over time. When you walk in, do you need to know that there's been orcs marauding? No, because you see orcs all over the place. You see that this area has had lots of attacks on it. You see orc emblems on the orc graffiti on the walls. You can walk in and know what's happening without us, giving you a bunch of quest text.
And then one of the powerful things that this allows us to do, if you can go into an area and you can get the big picture story just by looking at stuff and seeing what's happening there, then we can concentrate our efforts on telling the next level of storytelling, the more personal stories. We can adventures about the mother who lost a son fighting against the orcs, or we can give you a story about a shopkeeper who his whole livelihood is riding on this, and his family's future is riding on getting this next caravan into town on time. And it makes the story much more personal because you've already got that big overarching picture through the visual storytelling.
Right. So with limited voiceovers and the visual storytelling that we want to use, we really want the world to become alive, a place that you can interact without having to read a bunch of text. Move your mic closer to your face, Steve.
Closer.
Excuse me. So We covered our advanced AI. So as everybody on the panel but myself has mentioned, we have all of these stories being created. Will you be able to get tons and tons of lore through text? Absolutely. We're not taking that out. It's just not the only way. It's not our crutch for conveying information. So will there be libraries of things that you can read? Absolutely, because we're generating them. We have to generate them so that we can have all these amazing things. We had to generate the history, for instance, for the short stories to be created. Oh, back. So hold on. So can I get Maxwell and Robert to stand up? These two gentlemen here, and you can see their booth out there, have created some amazing stories from EverQuest's past, and they are fantastic.
Yes, they are.
Now, I know that only one of them is available right now through the app.
The Last Stand of the Tear Doll.
The Last Stand of the Tear Doll is available. And
It's on the website.
Robert's, I just finished reading Robert's last night as I was going to bed, and it's
The Fall of Bastion.
The Fall of Bastion is amazing. And, we're avid readers. We read a lot. And this is every bit as good as anything I've read in recent past. You guys really need to get in there, and it really brings the world alive. I can't wait to meet, no spoilers, but I can't wait to meet some of these characters in game because, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, all of these characters need to be rich and vibrant so that you can care. Thanks, guys.
And it's a very powerful form of collaboration with them too, because like Darren said, we gave them some history, we gave them places, things, people, what's going on in the world, and we drew upon the richness of the stuff that they wrote and pull that back into the game. So that kind of collaboration with authors only will enrich the world and just make the stories that much deeper and better.
And this is really just the tip of the iceberg, because I've got a stack of about 11 stories on my desk that I need to edit when I get back.
We're very serious about
Very
this
serious
extended universe sort of things that you're not going to even encounter in the game. You encounter them in history books, but you don't need to read a history book in a library. You can read these stories and find out exactly what happened, and it's very cool.
And we've talked a lot in each one of these panels, and even in the debut, about collaboration. Until it happens, it's all talk, right? Anyone can stand up and say, well, here's what I'd like to do. This is an example of what we are doing. And when we talk about collaboration, when we talk about changing how we're developing games, we talk about changing games and how games are played. Collaboration is one of the key themes that we're building upon, and this is just one example of how we are following through with what it is we're talking about. 2 years ago, it was ideas. Darren and I and Ryan sitting in a room designing. Now it is execution.
That's great. So let's talk about some of the characters that you'll meet. We wanted these characters to be memorable, but not just because we told you that they should be memorable. We wanted you to have relationships with these people. One of the reasons that we're doing so much, getting so many stories written is so that you can be introduced to these characters. We want them to be active participants in the world. Alongside of you, you get to involve. Think of Gandalf. Gandalf was a really cool character. He was very iconic and very heroic. One of the things that really made you love him is because he participated in these events. He wasn't, this mythical figure that you never saw. He wasn't, Sauron, I would say was a bad enemy. Because
he wasn't a quest giver.
You never saw him. Where was that feeling of, oh man, I really don't like that guy? Because you never saw him. You never had to deal with him. He was intangible. And Gandalf was very tangible and very much part of the story. And we want to have those memorable characters. We want to create, how many of you, as we saw in the thing, how many of you like Drizzt Do'Urden? Right? He was a really cool character, and you really loved him, and he had all these issues. We all have favorite characters from our lore and from other things that we've read, and we want to have these types of characters so that you can have these emotional bonds with them as well. Why do you go and you help this village? Because people you care about live there. Does anyone get emotionally bonded to the characters they read about in books? You absolutely do. And we want those same sorts of things here. And all it requires from us is to have a lot of background and a lot of time for you to be with them and to get to know them. So these are very, very personal connections to the people. We also really want our villains, before I get into this slide, we want our villains to be also personal. Villains are people too, right? They have rights. They want to be hated. There are some really good examples of villains who you just despise. But then there's also examples, as I mentioned Soren, where you're like, okay, I understand he's the bad guy, but he's never done anything to me. I mean, he doesn't strike me as on a personal level. You just know he's the bad guy.
In the book, you never even see him.
Right, you don't see him. So I'm going to draw on an example of a game that a lot of us have played recently. Borderlands 2. If you played Borderlands 2, raise your hand. Maybe a few of you. Had some cool, fun stuff in it. It's a good game. Obviously not the game we're making. But Handsome Jack was a good villain. The first 10 minutes, you just hate this guy. He's trying to kill you. He's killed friends of yours. They really build it to a point where you just don't like the guy. Our villains are NPCs. They're characters in the story. They're not just a facade, a cardboard cutout. We want them to be doing things. They are actively moving against you. You'll see them in the story. You'll want to kill them the whole time and be unable to, and then be frustrated by that, and eventually get your moment of glory where there's a resolution. And there's these feelings that can be evoked by this sort of thing in combination with AI and the visual storytelling is very powerful for us.
Yeah. Our villains are so much more than bags of loot in the bottom of a dungeon. Like, they're not that at all. They're that too, but in addition to that, they're also
They'll drop
characters.
loot. It'll be monk loot, but
If
they'll
you,
drop it.
if you had the choice between a person standing in the corner for the next 10 years with a question mark above their head or an exclamation point, or a character, be they a villain or a good guy, who actually participated in the game with you, who was driven by AI, who showed up when you were doing adventures, who you either had to kill or got killed by, and basically experienced the ongoing play of the game with, I know which one I would choose.
The choice is pretty clear.
Yeah.
Another reason that we keep mentioning is that we really want the story to be a part of this game. Sorry, the story to be a part of this game. The world to be a part of this game. The world is
A character.
A character. It has depth. It feels. I'm not talking just about the terrain. I'm talking about the environs. I'm talking about the towns and the villages and all the places that you go. And we back all this up with lore. So you'll be able to go out and actually perform archaeology. Hey, what was here before? Those people, whether or not this is supported officially as a progression or not, you can go out there and go, I know. Hey, who's the expert here on what's outside the city of Kinos? Well, I know every stitch of it because I've explored it all, and I found out that there's these ruins here, and the reason these ruins were here, well, I found that out in a story that Maxwell Alexander Drake wrote, or that Robert Lassendrope or one of our other authors wrote, and it's all there. We want to tie it all together.
And as Dave mentioned in the reveal, and I talked about yesterday on the world panel, we can literally paint the world using our collaboration with Storybricks, that technology, to implant these drives and desires into locations in the world so that the population reacts to those things. So again, whether it's some story tied to the history or something that's going on now at the present time, it's helping that story come alive in very active, interactive ways.
Thank you. All right, I'll pass it over to Steve or Ryan.
That's me. All right, so now you know a little bit about how our approach to world building went and what our goals were when we first started doing this. And I'm going to get into a little bit into the actual history of the game. So what you're looking at right now is a timeline of 20,000 years of recorded history on Norath. It's broken up into 4 eras and a bunch of different ages inside those eras. The eras are named for sort of the overriding society that had the most influence on Norath during that time. So you start with the Keldorain, then there's a Lost era, and the Dahl era, and the Combine era. What we're going to specifically talk about today is the Dahl era, which we'll get into in a second. And then the ages are divided up by a very specific event that happened that really changed the culture in some way, but didn't necessarily destroy the whole society or anything like that. They're still in charge, but something happened that changed it in a fundamental way. So we'll get into the Dahl era. So those of you that played EQ1 and EQ2 will recognize the word doll, or at least the syllable, I suppose. There's several different types of doll in the previous games: Quetta doll, Fair doll, Tear doll. And once again, we're using it the same way. It's basically another word for elf. And there's different types of elves. So the doll era covered 2,000 years of elven dominance across Norath. They were clearly far and away the most powerful force in society on the world. And it began with the Age of Ascension. Before the Age of Ascension in the Lost Era, it was a really dark time. There was a lot of evil creatures about. There wasn't much society to speak of. The elves mostly lived in small villages and whatnot, and they didn't really have control of their environment. They were really just fighting to survive. The Age of Ascension is where all that changed, and they started founding cities, having technology, and being able to defend their lands and form kingdoms and eventually empires and whatnot. So right after the Age of Ascension covers all that time right up until the elves figured out how to use I'm sorry, it went too far. Use the spires you guys are used to seeing in the wizard spires. That's actually the big shift for the elves in that era was when they figured out how to use those things to travel vast distances. So this opened up all kinds of opportunities for exploration, where they started to run into different races and different realms and regions and planes and whatnot. And this is where that's why it's called the Age of Allies, is where they started to form these bonds between the different societies and sort of build up an actual interracial society, I guess would be a good term for it.
And it's worth calling out that, again, because you have to, even though there's a lot of familiar things in here, don't assume that they're handled the same way in our storyline as previous games. So the spires that you're used to seeing may look like the regular wizard teleport spires that you're used to from previous games, but ours can actually not just take you to certain places on Norath, but to realms beyond Norath as well.
Like I mentioned, the alliances started forming between the different races and whatnot. And the elves even befriended the dragons in some form. This is a pretty big event because the dragons really brought a lot of magical knowledge to the elves, and it signaled a big change in the speed at which the society developed. The dragons were able to help them with a lot of magical knowledge and whatnot as they progressed. So this was really a golden age for all involved. Like, this was sort of the golden age of Norath, if you will, where everyone was mostly friendly. There were occasional squabbles or wars with aggressive creatures and whatnot. But for the most part, this was sort of the advancement age, where everyone was fairly happy and moving in the right direction. But as with all good things, it of course had to come to an end with your old friends, the Shissar, showed up and decided to ruin the party. So they first appeared friendly. The elves had, of course, had alliances and friends with all these other races, and this just seemed like another one that was going to be friendly. And I'm not sure what the elves were doing, trusting a snake, but they ended up betraying the elves. They were basically just biding their time for the perfect moment to betray them. So in the middle of another war that they had helped trigger, they actually betrayed the elves and attacked them and almost conquered Norath. They laid waste to several elven cities. It really looked dire, and the only reason the elves really came out of that was because of all the other previous alliances they had made with the other races. So the combined forces of the elves and the other races, small c, combine, turned the Shissar back and sealed the spires that led to the Shissar worlds.
I think it may have happened, Ryan, because the snakes have very expressive faces. They were probably smiling.
Because they read from a distance. And
Yes.
You can see
They
that.
were
snakes ever
visible from a
not
distance.
smile?
They were very, very, very emotional.
All right. We'll write that in. So this was a change in age here too. Right after the Shissar War, this is when the Takish Age happened, and most of you will recognize the name Takishiz from previous games, and that was their capital city. The Takish Age was a big shift because the elves became paranoid that could happen again. Maybe one of the other races was just biding time and waiting for them to be exposed and bring down their society. So they started. A lot of racial tension started to divide the empire. All the alliances they had became very strained. The elves sort of started to feel themselves superior, and that was really embodied in the Quetta doll movement. The Quetta doll started out as sort of it actually started out as a really positive force of sort of highborn elves, the best of society, if you will. War heroes and whatnot were considered Quetta doll, kings and dukes and things like that. But eventually, it sort of turned into, it turned into a bad thing where they sort of felt themselves superior to everyone else and really started subjugating all the other races. And the only reason,
Well, no, and again, this is one of those things where just because you're familiar with the term doesn't mean we're treating it the same way. So in previous games, Quadadal, Feardal, Tyrdal were different races, different subspecies of elves, and really in our game, the Quadadal is more like a social sect of elves. So there's kind of more like one elven race, and it turns out through the storyline, you'll kind of figure out how those subdivide and what that really means for those other names.
So the only reason this really worked for the elves is they had a unique form of magic that was sort of like a nuclear deterrent. Basically, they held all the magic cards and were able to not...
They're really good at playing magic.
Really good at mana. But yeah, so they had this higher form of magic that even the dragons were afraid of, and so that really allowed them to sort of have this vast empire and form the Takish Empire that imposed all this oppressive regime over all the other races. And terrible oppression. And this is a point where the dragons really they didn't like this at all. And even though the elves had high magic, it wouldn't let them have sort of the level of control over actual dragons that they did over other races. But there are lots of other draconic races that were allied with the dragons that they totally could subjugate. So like the kobolds is a really good example, like drakes and wyverns and things like that, all fell into this oppression as well. And this is when the dragons became isolated and went back up to Velius and basically didn't have anything to do with the rest of the Elven Empire or the other races for a really long time. All right. So the Takish Empire probably would have stood for hundreds and hundreds, well, it did stand for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it would have stood for hundreds more had it not been for the Sundering. And the Sundering was destroyed the capital of Takishiz, and the elves aren't exactly sure what caused it, but one of the teleportation spires exploded and basically covered the entire capital in miles and miles of rock. So there's a giant ruined city under this huge mountain where their capital used to be. High magic stopped working for some reason related to this as well. So the empire really fell into decay, and it triggered a lot of different civil wars where the previous kingdoms started fighting against each other and vying for power and whatnot. Eventually, they were all put down, and a sort of strained peace set in where a shadow of the old empire existed, and they were able to keep the peace and whatnot, but it definitely wasn't anywhere near the power level that they had before.